Hopefully this will be an interesting perspective with, again, different backgrounds on the panel, looking at how to preserve working lands. I think that was one of the, obviously, common themes throughout this conference. I think almost every breakout session and panel in some way touches on how do we utilize the industries and land uses that are currently preserving at no cost, right? The infrastructure, green infrastructure of Florida. How do we make sure that can stay well into the future? And it's not just going to be simply buying that land, right? It's going to be making sure that all these different industries can be successful, that the way we grow in Florida can make those industries successful. And so really that will be the idea of this discussion. So first we'd like to introduce, and I will give the abbreviated because I think we're at that point to sort of get into business, so apologies for my brief introductions. But again, I think you've already heard from Buck McLaughlin, who's the range manager for Avon Air Force Base. In addition to that, he's also the community outreach director for managing the range boundaries, if that's the sort of correct way to phrase it. Lindsey Stevens works for the Nature Conservancy here in Florida. Again, urban planning is a background, also fellow attorney, is the director of land preservation. Give me the title again. This is horrible. And I am the trustee for the Nature Conservancy in the room. This is the worst. Sustainable communities and protection. Okay, thank you. Also is an adjunct professor at FSU still with urban planning. And so it gives a great perspective on, again, growth, as well as, you know, one of the many things the Nature Conservancy does well is working federally on issues like the Farm Bill, which we'll talk about more. Jim is the head of Strickland Cattle Company. I don't think, who here doesn't know Jim? God, that's impressive. Either that or they were too embarrassed to raise a hand. That is about as good an introduction. But between Strickland Cattle Company, Blackbeard Ranch, all his conservation initiatives, Jim has really been a mainstay of bringing together agriculture and conservation in Florida like I've seen few other folks do. You know, it's easy to sort of make reference to it. It's a lot more difficult to actually show up to the meetings, walk the walk, be just as comfortable in a Nature Conservancy or other environmental organization meeting as well as at the Cattlemen's. I will also mention one of the other really important things about Jim is his ability and being part of one of the founding members for Florida Cattle Company is that innovative entrepreneurial spirit to actually have homegrown beef right here in the state, and we'll talk about the importance of that. But it's one of those initiatives that hopefully makes that land use viable well into the future. So with that, we'll start with sort of, I think the initial video, thanks to Buck, Hillary needs to, I think, narrate every video. You hear her accent just is the perfect narrator. But this is sort of a map to discuss that idea of Sentinel Landscapes and what, how you can have DOD and the military be a partner with environmental organizations and cattlemen. So with that, I'll hand it over to Buck to sort of talk about what are Sentinel Landscapes and how do you work with the community to create those Sentinel Landscapes as well as stakeholders like those by you today.
Yeah, excellent. Is this on? Hello? Is that any better? Okay. Thank you, sir. First, let me start off quickly. It's just such an honor to be here. I'm a career Air Force pilot. I never dreamed I would be doing this. My 15 minutes of fame, which turned out way better than I ever dreamed of it, involved a lot more sports cars and supermodels than bears. But we wanted to start off of that, and all credit to Eric Bindick and Grizzly Creek. There's a 12-minute version out there, and there's potentially going to be a 30-minute version. outlining the idea of the Sentinel Landscape Program. And that is a formal program, a memorandum of understanding between the Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Defense, all of which raised out of the idea and the recognition that these agencies, these federal agencies, have tremendous overlap in interests in particular landscapes. And with that program, which started out at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State, and now has grown to 10 locations, just most recently Northwest Florida receiving that formal designation. Avon Park was tied for the 4th in 2016 to get a formal designation. And what it is that those 3 agencies recognize these landscapes as particularly important for each of their agencies' goals and mission. And so it's an incredible honor to be part of that, and we really wanted to introduce that with the video. Obviously diverse landscapes, but the core between all of those is that working lands, the conservation, the ecological value, and then in support of a military mission. And I just think that in this context, it is a tremendous opportunity and frankly, a unique opportunity in that Florida is now recently the only state in the union that has 2 designated Sentinel landscapes. And quite frankly, it's BS that Northeast Florida didn't get the designation as well, because they are absolutely as deserving. And the intent from talking to them is to continue forward, designation or not, we're going to coordinate with them. Throw in on top of that, now you've got the Florida Wildlife Corridor connecting all 3. So I am coming to you today with less answers and more questions. How do we take advantage of that just incredible opportunity where you've got 3 federal agencies putting extra priority, and that terms, and with that comes funding and those things above other areas, that how do we take advantage of that, and how do we intrinsically link the wildlife corridor into these opportunities represented by the Sentinel Landscapes?
Perfect. And so in talking about Sentinel Landscapes, I mean, obviously it's important not just to base protection and buffering, but also to environmental groups and also working landscapes. So Lindsey, for the Nature Conservancy, can you talk about how, what value a Sentinel Landscape has for the Nature Conservancy?
Yeah, absolutely. So the map before is pretty remarkable, of course, with the wildlife corridor overlaid with the Sentinel Landscape. So, the ability to kind of take the wildlife corridor to the next level or open it up to more funding resources, that's clear. The great thing about the Sentinel Landscape Program is that it is landscape scale planning, and in the process of getting your Sentinel Landscape designated, you're building the stakeholder groups and the supporters for the Sentinel Landscape. So as a conservation group or as a landowner, when you're bringing a project forward, you already have supporters. You already have stakeholder groups that are behind your project, and from the inception of the Sentinel Landscape, so you're not having to take the time, quite frankly, to go out and find supporters for your project. So just straight off the bat, it's that landscape scale planning that Hillary mentioned in the video. It's having the whole stakeholder process brought throughout the inception of the Sentinel Landscape and moving forward, so you don't have to build that base. And then, of course, it's the funding part of it, right? A memorandum of understanding, it doesn't seem like the most glitzy topic, if you will, but when you're working with, whether it's state funders, but federal funders, it's like next level in terms of, no disrespect, but bureaucracy. Having a memorandum of understanding helps grease the skids somewhat in making it much easier, so you're not, you have agreed upon forms of contract. If you're talking about an easement, you already have pre-agreed upon forms to work off of. So you're not having to waste time, and it's still a timely process in terms of acquisitions. But but you're moved forward quite a bit from the memorandum of understanding. So it's important not to leave that as a footnote. That's important. And it also allows you in a Sentinel landscape to leverage funding, federal funding sources that otherwise couldn't be used as match. So not the most exciting, I would say, but certainly very important to getting a project funded and getting a project ultimately across the line.
No, and I love the how, again, having the map up, you're right, to sort of see how special it is to designate an area, right? And the point of, in Florida, having two, but to now see the wildlife corridor as that sort of connective tissue that makes them even more special and relevant is neat. And I think you've sort of seen other folks similarly. Drew, I know from the Water Management District, was pointing out everyone's been doing overlays of their asset, their effort, and how it relates to the wildlife corridor. And I think as the conference goes on, it's almost seeming more and more profound about it's actually lifting everyone up. So it's working for everyone so far. Jim, your thoughts on, how does agriculture, how does a cattle operation, is it really as good as it seems for working with some of these programs?
Well, one, I've got a real affection for Sentinel Landscapes and Department of Defense because my son is also a lieutenant colonel in the Army. And so I've learned a lot. In fact, I've traveled with Buck a little bit, and one of the things that we were talking as we travel is how do we work with adjoining landowners, contiguous landowners? How do, and of course at that time, this several years ago, I said, well, don't send the guy with shiny shoes and a badge and say, I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help you. Send somebody like a Tracy Dean or an Adam Bass or Noah and hire them under contract to do that, to get that local perspective of we're expanding, and this is why we sit at the kitchen table, because so many of our decisions are made at the kitchen table with our families, with our siblings, that we sit there. And I said also don't drag them the first meeting into a governmental agency office, and they sit there and you've got maybe 2 or 3 generations of people. Take them at where they live, habitat, and sleep. And the map was up there. Could you imagine trying to accomplish that today? The size and scope of that area, could you imagine trying to come up with that idea, plop those lines down today or yesterday and say, Buck really needs this? So I think that timing's everything, and we've all realized that. I think that's just why this has been such a huge success these last 2 days. Everybody's here. Everybody's at the table. Everybody's excited. Everybody wants to work together, and we are coming together. And as far as looking at a perspective, yes, there was the concern of burning woods, controlled burns around the area. There was some concerns about cell phone towers, of which a lot of us do make arrangements for cell phone towers. We're looking for anything to survive on that landscape. But I think that the studies that have been done, the grazing opportunities that are there, helps with that whole, and maybe not social media, but relationship value that there are cattle grazing on there. We are looking, I do believe Archibald has a project there. And so they're doing these things, and they're relaying, and whenever you pick up a Cattleman's magazine or a Farm Bureau magazine and you see Avon Park bombing range, Sentinel Landscape, and you see the data and the research that's coming off of that big, truly a landscape level operation, I think it's good for us, it's good for Florida, it's good for the economy.
Right. Lindsey, Buck, any comments? Any thoughts on how y'all have worked with agriculture?
Yeah, I'll jump in, and I really appreciated Jim's comments. It's great feedback from that guy from the government who's here to help. I think from some previous early on when I was in uniform, there may be a section of Florida statute that is directly relatable to me personally, and I'm happy to say that relationship has grown, but you don't believe it until you hear it from the landowner themselves, and so that was. I appreciate your words, Jim.
And so, Jim, I want to have you talk just a little bit more. And so on agriculture, we've talked a lot about the value of working lands in agriculture. And I think have sort of made passing comments about Yeah, yeah, yeah. It would be good to make sure agriculture is still successful, and there are threats, and, you know, we want to remove barriers for agriculture for being successful. Of course, you see pictures like this every day, right? Agricultural operation next to a boundary of development pressures. But it's not just the development pressure, right? But there are all sorts of other regulatory challenges, any number of things making agriculture more difficult. Can you talk just a little bit about, you know, what are those things that, again, if you're a family right now in agriculture, you're a corporation right now in agriculture, what are your barriers to staying in agriculture for the next 100 years? Some of the challenges you're seeing?
A lot of challenges. One of which, and I'm a very small operator, we have never, ever gained any massive land or wealth. I bet we've been in the cattle business since around 1860 here, because I think it was a love of the land and a love of cattle. We are not Yellowstone Ranch, and I am not John Dutton, I can assure you. I mean, that's just the way it is, and so many of us.
I knew this was going to go sideways at some
Yeah.
point, so there we go.
And some of us, you know, some of us appreciate being what we are, but whenever you start splitting that generational pie, you can only split it so many times. I mean, my friend Matt is in the audience, and he's seen it. I mean, you start out with X amount of acres, you begat some children, and all of those split. Well, you find out, like my son, he went to school, and he said, I'm not taking any ag classes. I'm not going to work as hard as my mother and you have worked for the last 17 years. It's not going to happen. He's seen us struggle. He's seen us live that life that I love, but he doesn't want a part of that life. So we find that those generations don't always want to come back to the family farm. As bad as we as parents want our children to be by our side and take over what we have, whatever it is, big or small, we want them to be a part of what we truly love, and it's heartbreaking when they're not, and we at some point come to that realization. But what we're looking at is so many factors. Politics is one of them. Politics is a huge part. And, you know, I use the analogy whenever it's Tallahassee or Washington, depending on who is in power at the time, we keep hearing that, oh, next year we're going to get this done. Next year we're going to get the budget. Next year we're going to get Florida Forever fully funded. Next year, rural family land. And it's like Charlie Brown and Lucy and the football. And at the last minute, she jerks the football away, and Charlie Brown buffed his rear end. That's what we have, so many of us sitting in this room have felt like, whether you're cowboys or ranchers, NGOs or government, that we have constantly heard it. I can tell you, y'all changed the temper of politics in Florida with what we're here today. Why and how? And you asked about the problems. Here's one of the solutions. The solutions are sitting in this building, in the Marriott, in 2022 with Earth Day coming up, and you have brought so many players, true players, to the table that are going to help. Because one of the things I constantly say is to deal with the problems and the pitfalls and the inheritance laws, you need politicians, you need politics. I was chairman of the NCBA, National Cattlemen's Beef Association Political Action Committee, for 2 years. One agricultural commodity beat me for 2 years. That was sugar. I came close, but I realized how much we need to have a voice. At that time, it was Washington, not the Capitol. And I also want you to know that one of the pitfalls is we are not tremendously wealthy. We operate on a slim margin of profit. It's a cow. We're price takers. There's only so many things you can do with a cow and take care of the land. And I'd like to think all of us want to take care of that land. We're not going to abuse that land because we want to leave it. That you get probably tired of hearing it, leave it for the next generation. Or we borrowed it from somebody and we're going to give it back. And deep down inside, we feel that way. But a lot of issues. We need friends. I could talk about a lot of issues at any time, but we need as many friends. If I have the opportunity to go into, whether it's Congress, testify, or whether it's Washington or Tallahassee or my local county commissioner, if I can take one of you, scientists, a biologist, an ecologist with me, that I can speak anecdotally, they believe us. If Matt and I walk in and we have a cowboy hat on, we're automatically deemed to have some sort of truth about us. We need you. We need the science. We need the research, because you will validate us with that research. So we need more research, we need more political stroke, and I didn't delve into what you asked me, but
We'll let Lindsey clean up there and get to the, but no, I think your point, I think before sort of getting to the next question, the agriculture needs friends, right? So often in the environmental side, environmental policy or other, we talk about regulations and what are the rules and what are the parameters, and it's so easy to sort of get lost in those conversations without thinking really long-term. We need to be having more conversations about, well, what are the policies that'll actually make agriculture successful, right? It seems like there are way too few of those and way too many of the just how can we regulate, right? Not that those are bad conversations to have, but if we want landscapes to be protected, agriculture needs friends, and there needs to not be this division in the room of, one side environmental and the other side ag. So one of those options, obviously, is Farm Bill, is big spot for policy about how to mesh those two things together. Lindsey, you see any opportunities coming up for us, knowing we'll have a Farm Bill, this fall, likely?
Actually, it's next fall.
Fall, next, okay.
Yeah, but the time is now, right, to prepare for that. And gosh, I guess we can jump into Farm Bill, but there's so much that
Yeah.
you put out there too, so.
Feel free to
Well,
clean up everything and anything Jim
No,
said,
we can-
too.
We can loop back at a later point on that, but as far as Farm Bill goes, really the time is now. The Nature Conservancy has worked for decades, huge priority for TNC. We're a global conservation organization, of course, focused on the Farm Bill within the United States. Over 2/3 of the overall land in our country is privately owned, and really the reason why the Farm Bill, it's a massive bill, of course. It deals with everything from food security to forestry, and of course there's easement components and other funding for agriculture. It's a huge focus for the Nature Conservancy and has been, and so the time is now. We're preparing our platform and anticipate to have that done by August. But we're really looking to talk to our partners here in Florida to see what ag's priorities are, so that we can make sure that we're advocating for the needs of our farmers in the state of Florida, because we recognize that our needs in Florida and the threats that we're facing are different than the needs of other ag interests in the central part of our country. We have potentially really some similarities with the state of Florida with other states like California, which has a thriving agricultural base that is very much threatened by climate change and growth pressures. And how can we align the programs and the funding programs to better fit the agricultural needs of our state? And we've highlighted some of these issues, and we see needs based on our experience in working with Farm Bill funding programs. If you're trying to pursue an easement on a citrus grove, which I think that we all would agree is an agricultural use, we would rather be growing citrus trees as long as we can, rather than having the final crop of houses go up. But the federal programs are challenging to have an easement of that type put into place. It just doesn't score as high as other uses. And that's just one example. So huge opportunities next year with the Farm Bill, but the time is absolutely now for folks to get together and come up with a cohesive sheet of music to sing off of when we go up to DC.
Which really stresses the point of, in order to be successful, and I think, again, Farm Bill and federal lobbying for those programs, you need to be able to walk shoulder and shoulder, and to have, essentially the panel we have, being able to advocate for the wildlife corridor, but connect it to these federal programs, both DOD and agriculture. I think is going to help us be successful, but it can't just be the three folks in the front of the room, right? You know, we need this same representation from everyone attending the conference. And I know we started a little bit late, so I think we're just about coming up to time. So it may be easier to sort of run short on questions for the panel from me and maybe open up for a few, or how are we doing on time?
Yep, we have time for 3 or 4 questions.
Okay.
If you want to ask one more and then.
Sure. Well, any wrap up? Yeah, Buck? Yeah.
Just a quick comment on what Lindsey said. When I started my role in this REPI process and was kind of learning through there, you know, you have the great agency, NRCS, wanted to work with them. It made perfect sense. At that time, the federal silos were in place, and you could not match federal money with federal money. And it was, I believe, the 2018 Farm Bill that allowed REPI to be considered as a non-federal funding source, a non-federal match to other funding. And that opened up enormous opportunities. But to Lindsey's point, the time is now. That works. I remember just being incredibly frustrated in this meeting somewhere here in Orlando, and I was talking, I think, with maybe Commissioner Putnam at the time, and just saying, okay, why can't I work with this agency? We want to work together, and you tell me I can't? And that changed. So I want to highlight that your inputs can make huge differences.
Perfect. So, it sounds like we've got time for a couple questions.
Oh, okay, just briefly on your Sentinel Landscape program, just explain that real briefly. In other words, you buy easements, or do you do that in partnership with NRCS and other agencies, or?
Yes, all the above. Since its inception about 2008, I believe the number is over 515,000 acres protected in perpetuity, primarily through easements, although I believe there is some fee simple in there. But it's a great point, because there's also landowner assistance and sustainable management practices that have covered another, I believe it's about 2.5 million acres across the country. And the Sentinel Landscape in itself does not change. It is not any additional regulatory activity. It's just an agreement on priority. So NRCS programs still work like NRCS programs. REPI funding is still available to work with REPI. The Sentinel Landscape in itself doesn't change those programs that have been so effective.
It does buy an easement for those pages.
It certainly can, and in our case, it has. That's been one of the primary tools that we've used at Avon Park.
Okay, good.
Yes, sir.
And Buck can correct me if I'm wrong, so maybe I shouldn't do this, but I mean, I would think of it as this planning tool that helps, so just as he said, aggregate together different groups to allow it to be easier for nonprofits, governmental agencies, everyone to sort of focus on an area, but it's coming with a bent of where's there the overlap of a key ecosystem type and also DOD need, right? So base, needing a base buffering, installation security, but also adjacent to, as you see with so many military bases, adjacent to lands that have been preserved, and you've got these critical ecosystem examples that are alongside them. Is that?
No, you said it perfectly. Those considerations, most of those go into that designation process. And unfortunately, you can't include everything, because if everything's important, then nothing's important. Yeah. So they do look at that very carefully. And then the other thing you said is it's a focus area. That's what it really is. It's a prioritized area where the 3 federal agencies I mentioned are going to really try to work together, focus their efforts, and like I said, give priority to funding sources.
Anyone else? Mallory? Yeah.
So earlier today and a lot throughout the last couple of days, we've talked about ecosystem services, and I'm curious for all 3 of your perspectives on maybe new programs or new funding opportunities through, Jim, if you could speak about Florida's Climate Smart Ag Working Group, and Lindsey, if you could talk about maybe NBUC, USDA opportunities and growing climate solutions, and how we can take advantage of that in Florida to help landowners and working lands thrive with respect to the wildlife corridor.
Thank you, Mallory. By the way, Florida Climate Smart Ag is actually a subsidiary of the National Climate Smart Ag, which is the United States, which is a subsidiary of the International Climate Smart Ag, of which a lot of our people will be in Rome I think it's May the 20th through the 26th, and they're having the meeting of the FAO, United Nations FAO, and they are speaking engagements with the ambassador too. So they go to all those meetings, but it trickles down to Lynetta Greiner and I were tapped to be the co-chairman of Florida Climate Smart Ag, and at that time we couldn't even talk about climate change in the state of Florida, so I had to preface everything with, I don't have tinfoil on my cowboy hat, but believe me, but now we have morphed, and it's great that we went from really looking at genetics, looking at forage types of changing climates, particularly in Florida. Climate change is somewhat, this is the target right here with the coast that we have and where we are with the hurricane seasons. So we know we're going to have those things. So we morphed from looking at genetics. We went to ecosystem services because we said if we are truly going to use agriculture be one of the major answers to climate change and sea level rise and where population is going to go, where species are going to go, we have to save the land. We now have, thank you very much for teeing that up, Mallory. We now have a $100 million ask to the Biden-Harris group that the Florida Climate Smart Agricultural Group, which Noah and Mallory are a part of, thank you very much. And so we have partnered with University of Florida, $100 million ask, and what we want to do is identify all of those ecosystem services that we do for society, the 22 million people that live here most of the time, whether it is wildlife corridors, carbon sequestration, oxygen, ephemeral wetlands, aquifer recharge, all those things, we want to know and put a value on it. It won't happen in a year or two, but we have the University of Florida Hypergator computer there, one of the ninth most powerful computers in the United States. We're working to take LIDAR, to take all those things that we all know about, compile them, come up with something, because sustainability means profitability, and in the state of Florida, it's going to be tough. Now, a conservation easement is not going to save us forever. Fee simple, we're not going to be able to do that. We need to come up with a rationale to identify what we do for populations that none of us get paid for. We don't particularly look to get cash, but if there's something on our IRS statement when we fill it out that we provide services for the rest of folks, that we'll be able to work down that road. We're also looking at a branded product to where if we have meat, is it going to be worth anything? And that's our major discussion in the last 2 days is with our meat products, can we put a carbon aspect to fresh from Florida? Or do we need a whole nother one here in the state of Florida? So you might see that in the future. We're going to work with that $100 million if we get that. And then we're addressing two things, timberlands and pasture lands. Those are the two big ones. We've also partnered with Tuskegee University, FAMU, for the obvious reasons that there are disenfranchised farmers and ranchers out there that we have to encompass under that. We're looking forward to it, and thank you, Noah and
Mallory, you wound them up.
Wow. Yeah, I don't know how.
You always have to, everyone knows, you got to be careful about winding them up.
Well, as far as the Farm Bill goes, so forest lands is certainly something, and ecosystem services is something that, for forest lands, it's absolutely on the table. Like you noted, part of the devil is figuring out the number, right? The number, the science, building the case, and translating that into policy. So a big opportunity, absolutely, in a creative way that is outside of the traditional buy an easement, buy fee approach. But it's also a spin on some existing programs, that are already out there. So makes total and complete sense and absolutely should be on the table for, what we're considering pushing the platform this next year.
Perfect. I think there was one last question.
No, I'm
sorry,
just
Buck.
going to jump in on that,
Yeah.
and then we'll get to you. Thank you. That's been one of my biggest frustrations in terms of payment for environmental services or easements less than perpetuity from a REPI standpoint. I just don't know what those are. And we have landowners who've not been able to meet their price expectations, so don't have a tool in engaging with them. And I think that's a skill set. and a tool in the toolbox that we really need. Because through pilot projects and things like that that have been done in other locations, particularly North Carolina, you engage that landowner at that lower level where they're more comfortable, get them into the program, they realize, hey, this is okay, maybe the feds are kind of here to help. And you build that trust, you build that relationship as talked before, and that is something I don't think we're doing here. I also just real briefly want to say, I emphasize federal programs, but particularly REPI and NRCS, we still work with state partners as too. I've got several easements with Rural and Family Lands, Conservation Florida, I think we've got 3, 4 maybe in the works. Polk County, working with them, and as well as the Nature Conservancy. So that Sentinel Landscape program is a partnership, not just purely federal.